Hello again for my online classes in the fall of 2019 for my full semester and second 8 weeks classes. Welcome back for our fifth recording of chapters. And so we're now on to Chapter 5, Civil Rights. This will be the last of our 5 chapters that we have for our first midterm exam. Some of the main issues to remember about civil rights is we're looking at rights among groups. Consider all the groups that you as an individual belong to. And do you believe that those groups that you belong to are being treated equally in the United States? Then the question can be, what is equal? And how do we know that someone is in fact being treated equally, or how some group is being treated equally? These are recurring questions when we look at the issues of civil rights. And so this branch of government is the one that is primarily involved in trying to determine what is equal. So laws can be passed, and then the review of those laws comes through the Supreme Court. This is a dated picture of the Supreme Court. Justice Kavanaugh is not in this picture, who replaced Justice Kennedy, the one that you see second from your right here in the picture. But the point being that actually this is a very dated picture, because it also has Justice Scalia on there, and Justice Scalia has passed away a few years ago. The whole point of the picture, though, is just to tell us the power of the court, and that the courts are the one that makes the determination of whether or not a law is constitutional and how it should be interpreted. So they're the ones that would interpret if in fact there's a violation of the 14th Amendment, one that we've brought up in some other situations, equal protection under the law. And so we have seen in recent years that the Supreme Court has ruled in some ways against behaviors of states that's deemed to be unequal, such as gerrymandering, drawing the districts to help one group of people over another, and was deemed to be inappropriate, what was happening illegal or against the spirit of the 14th Amendment in 2015 in the state of Alabama. But also the Supreme Court, going on 6 years now, has ruled that parts of the Voting Rights Act are not really necessary anymore. And so this was a case in which it would be the federal government that would determine whether certain states, and these are states from the old Confederacy, were in fact changing their election laws in a way that was not prejudicial against one group of people. And the basis of that has been with John Roberts. And John Roberts, as the Chief Justice, has deemed publicly that we're in a post-racial society. And so there's not really a need then to have laws that are determining based on race, or very few of those laws, a gradual reduction of those laws. This is important for us to consider. Are we truly in a post-racial society? One of Roberts' main arguments that say that we are is the election of Barack Obama. And so as having an African-American elected president, as far as he's considered, as far as he looks at this issue, Justice Roberts believes then that we are in fact in a post-racial society. But are people treated differently because of their race still in the year of 2019? We do see some situations, a couple of sources that I've recommended that you can review and use for your news reviews, have made some suggestions, some indications that there are different ways for people to be treated based on their skin color, their race. Police killings take place that are poorer and blacker than the U.S. as a whole. More police killings take place there. Whites killed by police tend to have a weapon. That is not always the case with blacks. This is a little bit misleading, but to show where you can see perhaps the greatest amount of income inequality. It's not really explained well on this map, but the darker areas are suggesting a greater amount of income inequality. And in those areas, especially if you notice here in the southeast part of the United States, that's where you also have a very high percentage of African American population in those areas. And that's also where you see then higher income inequality. It does suggest that we are continuing to deal with a struggle here to try to make progress, if in fact what we view collectively as progress is for more people to live a more equal life with one another and to have more protections and to have more opportunities. So if in that situation it is an ongoing struggle, as Frederick Douglass observed, a former slave himself, and in the 1800s, that there was a need to continue that struggle. And that struggle has been very harsh, and does also tell us that that struggle continues as we see that there are still people held against their will as slaves. And in many cases this may happen it almost always happens underground today, but it is still occurring. And it's important for us to take that into consideration. Remember that. So this is 9 years old, but unfortunately it probably has not changed much. An observation here by Time magazine, one of its conclusions by doing some research on the existence of continued slavery, despite more than a dozen international conventions banning slavery in the past 150 years, there are more slaves today than at any point in human history. So the treatment among people who were former slaves, primarily African Americans, has been a very negative treatment in a good portion of American history. The issue of slavery continues to exist around the world. Many people of different backgrounds can be held as slaves. Here in the United States, there's been other people that have had a very difficult existence in that struggle for greater equality. And American Indians, as a very good example, were not U.S. citizens until 1924. Women, this is the 100th anniversary, or coming up this next year will be the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote. A considerable struggle, first happening in 1920. And then other groups where, again, there's this consideration of just what does it mean to be equal? So the physically and mentally challenged, what rights do they have? What should they have in their opportunity to live a more enriched and full life? People of different sexual orientations, the same thing. And people of different ages, what rights should they have? In many ways, when we look at civil rights, we go back to the very violent period of American history. We look at the Civil War, and so there's 3 amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, that are referred to as the Civil War Amendments. So in that period, going even at the end of the Civil War or a few years after the Civil War, you have these amendments that are approved and ratified by the states. So there you can see and read about this area, read about these amendments here in your text. There was a backlash to the Civil War amendments, and so we can see here on the issue of creating more equality. There were states then that would view this as a states' rights issue and would come up with laws within the state that would segregate white and black America. white and colored America, as it was generally referred to. And these would be Jim Crow laws, as they were called. And Jim Crow laws are then legal segregation that would occur in many states, where people could be located within a motel room or different motel rooms, different restrooms, water fountains, bus stations, or where people could sit on the bus, where people could go to school. I think many of us here in this class are aware of that. But there were many states that carried out these laws, Oklahoma being one of those states. And there were towns then that were known as sundown towns. This is an excellent book, and a book that brings up some, again, unfortunate periods in American history about this period of segregation in the United States. Sundown meaning that someone who was not white, and primarily dealing with black Americans, African Americans, that you could not be in that town after dark, after sundown. So if you're interested in this book, it is an excellent book to read. So we'll do some independent research, and there'll be a 20-point bonus. We can see here that it's due by September 16th. Finding factual evidence that a town was indeed a sundown town. And this is what you would need to do to provide that. There'll be a folder, and you would submit your information just like we do with the news reviews on that folder. And so you need to evaluate if you want to spend some time doing this to make this determination. The Supreme Court also then made the interpretation that having a segregated system was in fact within the confines of the 14th Amendment, was in fact a fair interpretation, a constitutional interpretation, in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson. And so the phrasing here, as you'll see when you read through the text, is separate but equal. If facilities were separate but equal, you could in fact have segregation. We can probably surmise from our history that in most cases they weren't really equal, but they certainly were separate. And so in some other areas where you would continue to see this segregation, white primary, only whites could vote. Question then, would you consider a political party to be a private club? And the courts have ruled many recently in the last 40 or so years that actually, even going back longer than that, they've ruled they're not a private club. But at this time, a few years after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the courts didn't have that interpretation, then allowed for one party, generally in most parts of the South would have been the Democratic Party at that time, would have then been the only party to nominate candidates, and they could determine who would be involved in that political party. And then the opportunity to vote, you'd have to prove that you're illiterate to vote, and maybe that might sound well-intentioned, but the way that this was imposed on people was very arbitrary, and some people who could read were prevented from voting because of what they would have to read or try to interpret. It would be very difficult to do, and perhaps not even in the English language, and would cause people to fail or to have to pay taxes to vote. And all of this is limiting people's opportunities to go vote. So interest groups were involved in trying to stop this type of behavior. Two of the better known interest groups we can see here. And we'll go into much more detail about interest groups when we get to chapter 11. But it is important to consider that people would join associations and organizations to help them be active politically and either support a cause or defeat other causes. And so in this case, support the cause of equality and defeat segregation. And so for women, the idea that they should be treated equal, and one of the ways that they can be treated equal is to have political equality, that they have that opportunity to vote just like men. And so that was a movement that started way back even in the 1840s, perhaps even earlier than that in some cases, and finally reached its success by 1920. In the process of ending segregation in many aspects of our society, one of the first areas of doing that was with this president after World War II, desegregation of the armed forces, that you wouldn't have separate military units for whites and blacks, that you can now integrate people of different races and backgrounds into the same military units. But that did not happen until after World War II, and with this president here doing that, Harry Truman. And Truman was quite incensed by some of the behaviors that he had read about and was informed of African American soldiers coming back from the war, serving this country, getting medals, doing all kinds of brave acts, and being harmed, beaten up when they came back to this country. So tried to start that process by desegregating the armed forces. In education, this is a landmark case, very important to follow, pages 167 to 171. And in a state that we generally don't consider to have segregation, Kansas, you had the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, that had segregated school systems. Was this a violation of the 14th Amendment? Should there not be separate schools based on race? And the courts ruled 9-0 decision that this was a violation of the 14th Amendment. And so you cannot have separate but equal education systems. And so this begins the process legally of looking at segregation and finding ways to end segregation in a legal system. As your text refers to that as de jure segregation, D-E-J-U-R-E. Wasn't easy, of course. You can read about this on page 168, some of the events that African Americans, especially in this case in Arkansas, went through just trying to go to school, and a very difficult and unfortunate time to see these kinds of events occur. And it got to the point where federal troops were brought in by President Eisenhower to try to begin the process of allowing segregation in the schools of states that had legal segregation, to start to desegregate these schools. Perhaps what was most important was what's referred to as the Civil Rights Act, and this is very important to remember. And this law had the most effective way of ending segregation by finding ways to punish states through reduction in funding. Think about fiscal federalism that we referred to in Chapter 3. And here you can see the president that really was the leader in this process, and that was President Lyndon Johnson. There you can see him shaking hands with Martin Luther King Jr. and beginning the process of now having the federal government ensure that legal segregation in states would start to end. These were the ways of trying to end that segregation. The discrimination in public accommodations, restrooms, libraries, those kind of things. Discrimination in the schools, and ending the arbitrary discrimination in the voting practices. Not to say that this has been successful, even though the Supreme Court has now ruled that we don't need as much involvement by the federal government to try to ensure desegregation and equality. But there certainly has been many years of a struggle to ensure the spirit and the protections of the Civil Rights Act. In this particular case here, Heart of Atlanta Motel versus United States, looking at the issue of the legality of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and so this was brought to the attention of the court that they would have to make an interpretation that in fact the the Civil Rights Act was constitutional? Was it a correct interpretation of the 14th Amendment? Could Congress actually pass something like this? So it had been passed by Congress. Now it was up to the Supreme Court to make a determination if it was constitutional. So you had challengers here saying private businesses should be able to decide who can stay in their motel. Ultimately, the courts came back and reviewed this and determined that through the Commerce Clause, the U.S. Supreme Court had the right, the United States Congress had the right to make a determination on how businesses could operate, especially if those businesses were benefiting from interstate highways and other kinds of taxpayer-supported areas of financial support and infrastructure. And so in that case, that's how the court ultimately concluded that it was constitutional. Turn our attention now to women's rights, and women also have been viewed as secondary citizens, second-class citizens, or perhaps not even citizens. In some levels, perhaps just viewed as property. And so this has been a struggle to try to ensure more equality. One of the ways of looking at both women and people of different races is to consider, are there times in which there is an understandable reason for discrimination? And this is, I think, important for us to consider. So notice here in your text on page 180 to look at the intermediate and strict scrutiny test. So might there be times in which there's an understandable reason in which some person may not be able to have an opportunity because of their gender or race? And the intermediate burden of proof is partially on both the government and on the challenger, the state and the defendant, or the state and the plaintiff. Now, in this case, can there be a situation, a particular job that a woman may be applying for, that the requirements for that job make it more difficult for most women to be able to succeed? And maybe the requirements of the job are so important that if it does discriminate against women, it's still understandable and to be protected. That very seldom would ever be the situation for race or ethnicity, to say that because of someone's race or ethnicity, they do not get a particular job. And I don't think there's very many examples there. Perhaps one would be a detective or FBI agent, let's say, having to go undercover. And perhaps in some of those situations, it just would not be possible for someone, or very manageable for someone of a particular race to do the undercover work. But in a physical fitness test, let's say, that deals with upper body strength, and most women would not be able to attain that amount of upper body strength, is it still understandable to have those tests, even if it may discriminate against most women? Perhaps the test for the job demand is worthwhile. Firefighter tests are one of the better examples of this. The job of the firefighter to be an effective and useful firefighter, an important firefighter, to be able to save people's lives, is to have a certain amount of strength to be able to carry someone down a ladder. And so if a firefighter is not able to do that job, then that firefighter is not effective at the job. And so therefore the necessity to be able to pass a physical fitness test is part of what is necessary, what is needed for the job. So in that case, if it means that women have a much more difficult time being able to succeed in that job, then for the sake of being able to do the job effectively, it's an understandable form of discrimination. How do you end something that's viewed as unofficial segregation, and that's de facto segregation? So how do you end that? this becomes, in our history, much more difficult to do than de jure segregation, as I mentioned, segregation that is by law. So one of the areas of de facto segregation has been viewed to be busing. And so you have people living in certain neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods have been built up of people of particular ethnicities or races. Schools then are from those neighborhoods. And people of particular races or ethnicities consistently go to the same schools. And so you don't have much integration among races or ethnicities. And so perhaps trying to create more integration, to have more racial balance, and to have perhaps a greater distribution of funding, busing has been one of the ways of trying to achieve that. But this has been quite controversial and perhaps not very effective. But it is one of the ways of trying to deal with this disparity that's happened in an unofficial way. There's no law that's caused that disparity. It's just been a tradition of how people have lived within neighborhoods. You can see here also in your text there's a area there dealing with the universalization of civil rights and some of the other areas to consider, such as ageism. And are there, again, thinking about understandable times to discriminate. And does that mean to discriminate against people based on their age? And beyond that, we can see here also the issues of extending civil rights to people of different backgrounds beyond white and black America or male and female America. So you have a case involving Latino Americans, and you can read about that on pages 184, 186 to end segregation for Latino Americans in schools. For Asian Americans that are born in the United States, they are citizens just like any other group of people born in the United States. Pages 189, 190. And for Native Americans, that they have the opportunity to learn in school with their native languages. You can read about that on page 191. And for disabled Americans, the Americans with Disabilities Act found to be constitutional, that there needs to be reasonable accommodations to allow people to work and to go to school, and with the use of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So on the issue of ageism, coming back to that issue, is it an understandable and allowable use of discrimination for people based on particular jobs in order to do this job? So you do see that there are some particular areas where once you reach a certain age, you can no longer do that job. And generally viewed to be acceptable. We also see there's a rational basis here on page 180 to have discrimination against youth. And I'm assuming that many of you taking this class would fall into these categories. So then we look at the discrimination of people, in this case same-sex couples. Is it an understandable use of discrimination? The courts have ruled that it's not an understandable use of discrimination to prohibit sexual acts between same-sex couples that would be allowed for heterosexual couples. And so in that case, that's where you can see that this is viewed, or perhaps can reach a conclusion as to why the courts would view that that's a violation of the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court made that ruling. You can read about that, as you can see, pages 192, 193. Last few slides that we'll look over deal with this issue of who should be admitted into college and how do you make a conclusion on who gets in and who doesn't. If you're looking at some of the more well-known and influential universities in the United States, making a determination of who would get in and who doesn't might become very competitive. and not always easy to reach a conclusion as to why some person did get in and another one didn't. If, let's just say, you have requirements that you have to have a 3.2, you have to have a 28 on your ACT, you have to be in the top 10% of your class, pretty demanding type of requirements there. And yet, if you have 5,000 slots to get into the freshman class, and you have 10,000 people that applied that met those requirements, how do you then determine which 5,000 of the 10,000 get in? And that's where we're seeing the difficulty of reaching this conclusion. So you'll see on pages 195 and 197 in the University of California v. Bakke case that having a quota system was a violation of the 14th Amendment. So to say there's only a certain number of white males that you'll take into the university and no more, no matter how qualified another white male would be, that's a violation of the 14th Amendment. However, the court did rule, and as we can see here, this case is now over 40 years old, but did rule that considering race is also allowed. That perhaps if you have an imbalance on the number of people of particular races in your school, that you can consider a qualified applicant of one of those underrepresented races and use that as a reason for admission. More recently, we've had cases dealing with what's the University of Michigan, and so they're referred to as the Michigan cases. You'll see this on page 197 of your text, and has been upheld, as you can see there as well. So having diversity within the law school is a good enough reason, according to the court, to consider people's race, gender, ethnicity. Not a good enough reason to have a point system and award people points to get into the undergraduate program of the University of Michigan. And that's been viewed to be unconstitutional. So how do you stay within the interpretation of the 14th Amendment in order to promote diversity? We can see that that's somewhat of a difficult situation here in the school systems of America, the higher level of education in the university system here in the United States. And so we're left then with this ongoing challenge from both these recent chapters that we've covered. Chapter 4 focusing on the rights of individuals, and then this chapter we just covered here, the rights of groups. Ongoing challenges for sure. We'll be shifting our attention now to chapter 6 and looking at public opinion polling and how we reach our determinations about politics, an area called political socialization. So that's what we'll cover when we look at chapter 6.